I never sent for a wife. Wade Corrigan's voice carried flat across the depot platform, and by spring, this same rejected cowgirl would stand between his ranch and the auction block. It was April of 1886. The town was Sable Ridge, Wyoming Territory, and not one soul on that platform believed a word of what was coming. Least of all Wade. Stay with me a while. This stretch of Wyoming Territory has given me plenty of stories over the years, and none of them opened worse than this one. A woman steps down off a stage with a letter in her trunk and a promise in her chest, and inside of 2 minutes a stranger takes both of those things apart in front of 40 witnesses. That's where we begin. But I want you to stay past the humiliation, because what Junia Vale built out of that wreckage is the whole reason this story is worth your evening. Junia had grown up on her father's spread outside Independence, Missouri, on land that never quite paid for itself, no matter how hard the Vales worked it. Her mother died young. Her father raised her the only way he knew how, which meant she'd learned to gentle a green colt before she'd learned to sew a straight hem, learned to doctor a bloated steer before she'd learned to keep a proper kitchen. She could read a herd's mood from 200 yards off. She could pull a breech calf with her bare arm in the dark and not lose the cow in the process. When her father died of a winter fever, the bank took the Vale land inside of 4 months, and Junia was left with a saddle, a rifle, and a reputation nobody in Independence much wanted to hire, because a woman who could outrope half the men in the county unsettled folks more than it impressed them. She found the notice in a stock grower's bulletin, not a marriage paper, a rancher up in Sable Ridge, Wyoming Territory, wanting a wife willing to work a failing spread back to health. Hard-working, good with animals, plain speech preferred. It was the good with animals that caught her eye. She wrote back the same night. 3 short, business-like letters passed between them over 5 weeks, signed W. Corrigan, and Junia let herself believe it didn't matter that she'd never heard his voice or seen his face. What mattered was a place that wanted exactly what she had to give, instead of being ashamed of it. The morning she left Independence, Junia sold the one horse she still owned outright, a rangy, sorrel gelding her father had broken and she had finished, the last living piece of the Vale spread, because the fare east to Wyoming Territory cost more than she had, and a woman traveling alone couldn't well bring a saddle horse on a passenger stage regardless. She stood in the auction yard and watched a stranger lead him away without letting a single tear show, because that was the other thing her father had taught her. Grief was a private animal, best fed after dark and never in front of men who take it for weakness. She kept the bridle. It rode north with her in the bottom of her trunk, oiled and coiled and useless, a promise to herself that she'd own horses again someday, on ground that couldn't be taken out from under her a second time. Wade Corrigan had never written a single one of those letters, and that was the whole trouble. 4 years before Junia's stage ever rolled into Sable Ridge, Wade had a wife named Marion and a boy named Jonah, not yet 3, and a house that didn't have a locked room in it. Fire took the north wing on a July night while Wade was out chasing 2 strayed steers he never did find. He got back in time to watch the roof cave and to pull what was left of his family from a house that had already decided their fate for them. The scars ran from his temple down past his collar, souvenirs of the beams he'd gone back under twice. After that, Corrigan Ranch bled slowly. Cattle went unbranded. Fences rotted where they stood. The banknote his father had taken out in better years came due every spring, and every spring Wade scraped together just enough to keep the wolves one step back from the door. That final winter, the note stood at $1,400, due in full by the first thaw, 90 days out from the very morning Junia's stage rolled in. Wade needed help he could not afford to hire and could not bring himself to name out loud, which is exactly the kind of trouble that pushes a lonely man toward a mistake he never intended. The mistake wore the shape of Effie Prescott, his neighbor's daughter, a girl who handled his correspondence out of pity and on her own initiative turned a gripe about needing a hired hand into a full bride advertisement. Wade found the letters sitting in his desk drawer 2 weeks before Junia's stage was due, and by then there was nothing left to do but wait for a stranger to arrive, believing herself already promised. The stage rattled into Sable Ridge in a wash of dust, and Junia stepped down onto packed earth that felt like the whole territory had turned to watch her. Because it had. The town was smaller than the bulletin let on. A general store, a saloon, a church with a steeple that leaned like it had long since given up pointing straight toward heaven. A gray-haired woman near the boardwalk swept her eyes over Junia in one unkind pass and made no secret of her surprise that Wade Corrigan had actually gone through with sending for anybody at all. A ripple of low laughter moved through the gathered crowd. Junia kept her spine straight, her trunk at her feet, and waited. Wade rode in from the North Road 10 minutes later, and even from a distance, Junia could tell he wasn't what those letters had promised. He sat a horse like a man who'd been born to one. Scars marked one whole side of his face and crossed his throat above his collar. He came down out of the saddle with the careful economy of someone who'd learned the hard way that wasted motion cost something. And he closed the last 10 feet on foot without a shred of softening in his expression. "You're Junia Vale." Not a question. He didn't wait for her to confirm it. "I am." She'd barely gotten the words out before he cut clean through whatever else she meant to add. "I never sent for a wife." The line came out flat, worn smooth by however many times he'd rehearsed it on the ride in. "My letters were written by a neighbor girl who thought she was helping me. I needed a hired hand for the ranch. Somebody mistook that for a marriage advertisement, and I didn't find the mix-up until it was too late to wire you and stop the trip." The street went dead quiet at her back. Heat crawled up Junia's neck and into her cheeks, but she didn't let her voice shake. "You could have sent word. 2 weeks is time enough for a telegram." "I should have." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "I'm offering you work instead. Room, board, a wage at the end of the month, if you're willing to earn it honestly. I won't pretend this is anything but what it is. I'm not looking for a wife." Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed under her breath, quick and cruel. Junia's first instinct was to turn around, climb straight back onto that stage, and leave Wade Corrigan to explain himself to an empty street. She had every right to it. But $9 was all that stood between her and nothing. No position waiting anywhere back east, and a father's voice in her memory reminding her that quitting on another man's timetable was the one thing a Vale never did. "I'll think it over, tonight." Wade gave one short nod, mentioned the boarding house would hold her trunk, and rode off without a backward glance, though at the last bend he turned briefly in the saddle, and quiet enough that only she caught it, allowed that she'd come a long way for nothing, and it wasn't fair to her. Then he was gone, and Junia stood alone in a street full of strangers who already believed they knew her whole story. A gentle-faced woman named Agnes Odell, who ran the boarding house Wade had pointed her toward, took Junia's elbow and steered her clear of the crowd. Over tea that evening, Agnes filled in the rest of it. Marion, the boy, the fire. 5 years of a man refusing every kindness the town tried pressing on him. "He's not cruel," Agnes allowed, gentle but certain. "He's been half buried alive since that night, and nobody's yet figured how to dig him back out." It didn't excuse the depot, but it went some way toward explaining the ice in his eyes, and something in Junia softened toward him, even as her pride kept on aching. She sat with the choice until the lamp burned low. Home meant returning to nothing. Staying meant proving Wade Corrigan wrong about every word of that street corner speech. By morning, she'd decided, and she carried her own trunk down to where Wade waited with the wagon, making plain that she was accepting the work, not the charity. The ranch sat an hour out on open prairie, weathered gray, its porch sagging on one end, its garden strangled under 3 seasons of weeds. Wade laid out the rules on the ride in. She'd sleep in the old hired hand's cabin out back. Meals at set hours, the work done properly with no corners cut. And one more thing, the east bedroom upstairs stayed locked, and she was not to ask why. Junia understood exactly whose room that had been and let the matter rest. The first weeks tested every part of her. She was up before the roosters, coaxing a stove fire out of damp kindling, cooking a breakfast Wade ate standing at the window without so much as a glance her way. She scrubbed a house that hadn't known real cleaning in years, mended curtains that came apart in her hands, turned her attention to a garden gone entirely to ruin, and a chicken coop that hadn't been mucked since Marion died. Outside was where Junia truly went to work, though. She rode the fence line and found 40 head of cattle scattered and unbranded across 2,000 acres of open range, half of them thin as fence rails from a hard winter of neglect. She doctored a mare with a hoof abscess Wade hadn't caught. She rebuilt a stretch of collapsed corral rail with her own 2 hands in a single afternoon. And when Wade found her hammering the last post home, he stood a long moment watching before he found any words at all. "You know cattle." A flat statement, plain surprise underneath it. "Better than I know a needle and thread." Junia didn't look up from her work. "You sent for a wife on paper and got a stockman instead. Might be the one honest mistake in this whole arrangement." That same week, a late-season thunderstorm rolled off the mountains and spooked the herd loose from the north pasture in the middle of the night. Wade was 2 hours out mending line shack roofing and wouldn't be back before morning. Junia heard the first crack of thunder and the cattle bawling and didn't stop to think. She was in the saddle, bareback inside of 5 minutes, lantern lashed to her belt, cutting the panicked herd off from the ravine before 90 head could pour themselves over the edge in the dark. It took her most of the night, soaked through and half frozen, working the flank alone with nothing but her voice and a coiled rope to turn them. By dawn, the herd stood bunched and steaming in the near pasture, exhausted but whole, and not one animal was lost. Wade rode in at first light to find her already at the stove, wet hair braided back, saying nothing about it at all. It was Mrs. Odell, hearing the story secondhand from a ranch hand who'd passed the news along the road, who made sure the whole town eventually knew that the rejected mail-order bride had saved Corrigan Ranch's entire herd single-handed in a storm, while its owner slept 2 hours away. On the 6th morning, rain had soaked clean through her cabin roof and left the kindling too wet to catch. She was on her knees at the stove, close to tears with frustration, when Wade came in through the front door and, flat as ever, informed her she was doing it wrong. Something in Junia broke loose after a week of swallowed pride. She rounded on him with every ounce of it, being judged for weather instead of work, being watched for a failure he could hold up as proof he'd been right about her all along. Wade went still, and for the first time the corner of his mouth twitched towards something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've got a temper. Didn't expect that. There's a good deal about me you never bothered to find out." She shot back the words and walked past him to feed the fire he'd already gotten burning without her noticing. After that morning, something between them shifted, though neither could have named the change out loud. Wade started leaving her small, wordless proof that he'd noticed her. A hammer and nails by porch steps she'd complained were rotting, extra firewood stacked by her cabin door ahead of a hard frost, a new pair of work gloves left on the kitchen counter without a word attached to them. He'd hand out gruff, practical guidance. Gather eggs in the afternoon, not the morning. The garden needs more water than you're giving it. Pronouncements more than conversation. But Junia paid attention, and the land rewarded her for it. The garden greened back under her hands. The herd, gathered and doctored and finally branded proper, grew from 40 head to something closer to 90 by the time the first hard freeze hit. A half-wild barn tom with one torn ear started showing up on the porch steps for her supper scraps. She christened him Colonel, and the evening Wade laughed out loud, short and startled, at the name. Something warm unfurled in her chest that she didn't dare examine too closely. Word of the storm night traveled, the way it does in a county with more cattle than people. And by late autumn, a neighboring rancher named Otis Bramwell showed up at the Corrigan gate, leading a bull too sick to stand on its own. He'd heard, plain and simple, that the woman out at Corrigan's knew more about doctoring stock than the two so-called veterinarians working the whole territory put together, and he was desperate enough to try it. Junia worked over that bowl for 6 straight hours, packing a twisted gut and dosing it with a mixture her father had sworn by, while Otis paced the corral fence, expecting to lose the animal by morning. The bull lived. Otis rode home a changed man on the subject of Junia Vale, and within a month, 2 more ranchers had quietly sought her out over a lame horse and a breech birth gone wrong. Men who wouldn't say a word about it in town, but showed up at the ranch gate anyway, hat in hand, when their own stock ran out of options. Annie Oakley is remembered for a piece of frontier wisdom that fits Junia's whole approach to that hard first season. Aim at a high mark, and you'll hit it. Aim at a low one, and you'll hit that instead. Junia had never fired a rifle at a county fair, but she understood the bones of that idea all the same. She hadn't ridden 1,000 miles to be somebody's hired hand for the rest of her days. She'd come to build something, and if it had to be built out of another woman's abandoned garden and a stranger's cold silence, then that was simply the ground she'd been given. 3 weeks in, Agnes Odell rode out with a basket of apples and found a ranch transformed. Clean windows, a mended porch, bread rising warm on the counter. This place hasn't looked so alive since Marion was here. The name landed on Junia like a stone dropped into still water. When Wade came in from the barn and found Agnes at his own kitchen table, his welcome ran cold enough that Junia flushed with second-hand shame on his behalf. Afterward, he made it plain he'd rather she not encourage visitors, that this wasn't a social house. She brought apples. Folks are already talking, Wade cut back, and the longer you stay under my roof, the worse it gets for you. Understanding landed on her cold. It wasn't his own name he was guarding. You're worried about my reputation. A long pause. Then why did you let me stay in the first place? He had no answer for that one, not that day. That night she cooked chicken and dumplings, the way her own mother used to. No particular reason given even to herself. Wade tasted it and went quiet. My mother made this, haven't had it in years. He asked her for the first time to sit and eat across from him instead of alone in the kitchen. And over that meal he opened up, slow and careful, like the words cost him something, that Marion had loved growing things, had a real gift for coaxing green out of poor soil. It was the first time he'd spoken his dead wife's name to Junia on purpose, rather than by accident. Junia didn't fill the quiet that followed with comfort he hadn't asked for. She simply let him keep it. Winter tightened its grip through November. The little cabin out back turned bitterly cold, and one frost-white morning Wade found Junia shivering over a dead stove, and in a voice that allowed no argument, informed her she'd move into the spare room upstairs before she froze solid and left him explaining her passing to the sheriff. What will people make of that? She threw his own worry right back at him. I don't much care anymore. Something in his face had gone fierce. You're not dying in that cabin to save my good name. So Junia moved into the main house, and the rhythm of their days shifted again. His boots on the floorboards late into the night, coffee already brewing by the time she woke. The strange domestic comfort of sharing a roof with a man who felt less and less like an employer with each week that passed. She caught him sometimes watching her with something a good deal warmer than his usual iron composure, and told herself it meant nothing, even while lying awake admitting to herself that it meant a great deal indeed. The trouble that had been circling finally landed in early December, when Prue Whitlock's wagon rattled up the frozen road while Junia had her hands buried in bread dough. Prue Whitlock's husband sat on the church council, and Prue herself had never once in her life mistaken silence for privacy. She settled at the kitchen table, uninvited, and got straight to it. A young, unmarried woman sleeping under a bachelor's roof, no chaperone, no propriety, and no amount of scrubbed floors was going to scrub the talk out of Sable Ridge. A rancher 2 counties over let a hired girl live in his house the same way, and it ended in scandal there too. Mark me, Wade Corrigan is damaged goods, and you're wasting your good years trying to mend him." The cruelty of it took Junia's breath clean away. "You don't know him." Steel under the quiet. "And you don't know me either, not after 3 months." Prue left the threat hanging plain in the winter air on her way out. The church council would not let this stand. Wade came in from the barn to find Prue Whitlock's boot prints still cooling on his porch, and got the whole account from Junia in 4 clipped sentences. "My arrangements here are my own business," he ground out, jaw tight. "Not when the whole town's talking about them," Junia pushed back, and for the first time she voiced the thought she'd been carrying for weeks, that maybe she ought to leave, take the sting out of it before it grew worse for him. "Don't." The word came out rawer than anything she'd heard from him yet. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." 4 days later, Sheriff Cole Bannon rode out alone, his face apologetic before he'd said a single word. The church council, he laid out plainly, had voted to draft a formal complaint of moral turpitude and carry it before the territorial judge on his next circuit through Sable Ridge, seeking a legal order to put Junia off the property for good. Worse, the church had voted to cut Corrigan Ranch off from every kindness the community usually extended. No credit at the general store, no neighborly help come branding season, a slow social death for a spread already fighting the bank for its life. "It's thin, legally speaking," Bannon allowed, but Reverend Kane's got the whole congregation stirred up, and once the church decides a thing, most folks fall in line whether they favor it or not. He left them holding an unspoken option in the cold air, one he wouldn't quite say outright, but both of them understood plainly enough. A married woman couldn't be accused of living improper under her own husband's roof. Wade turned to Junia the instant the sheriff rode off and took her hands in his, and his were shaking. "Don't answer yet. Just hear me through." What followed wasn't only about silencing the council, though it would surely do that too. These months with her here had reshaped the whole ranch, and reshaped him along with it. He didn't want to wake one morning and find her gone. And if marrying her was what it took to keep her, then he was asking, not because the town had forced his hand, but because he genuinely wanted to. Junia searched his scarred, honest face for the doubt she was certain must be hiding somewhere in it, and came up empty. "This is completely insane." "It is," he agreed, something close to a real smile finally breaking through. "Ask me anyway." The church council did not let the matter drop quietly, and the true reckoning arrived 2 weeks later, when Reverend Amos Kane rode out to Corrigan Ranch with Silas Whitlock, Prue's husband, and 3 other elders trailing behind him, determined to settle the question before any wedding could take place. Wade met them on the porch with Junia standing beside him, refusing outright to be sent inside. The Reverend held forth on moral standards and Christian duty. Silas Whitlock leaned hard on the congregation's thinning patience. And then Junia stepped forward, past the men's startled glances, and set a leather ledger book down on the porch rail where every one of them could see it plainly. "You want to talk about what's improper, gentlemen? Look at the numbers instead of the gossip." Her voice carried clean across the yard. 40 head of scattered, sickly cattle when I arrived here. 91 head now, branded and wintered, worth more than this whole ranch owed the bank a season back. A garden feeding 2 people through winter instead of standing dead under weeds. A house that isn't falling in on itself anymore. That's 3 months of honest labor, and I've got the tally right here to prove every bit of it, the same as any hired hand you'd trust with your own herds. A pause, quieter now but no less steady. "The only impropriety on this land is a town judging a hard-working woman's character on rumor instead of results." A heavy silence followed, and it was Otis Bramwell, a rancher 2 spreads over who twice leaned on Junia's advice for a sick bull, and twice watched the animal pull through, who broke it. "I've watched her work with my own 2 eyes. Half the men in this territory couldn't have turned this place around the way she has. I'll not stand here and watch her run off for it." 2 more ranchers murmured their agreement, uneasy but real, and even Sheriff Bannon, off to one side, allowed he'd never once caught a shred of impropriety across 3 separate visits. Reverend Kane's face went red with a fury that had nowhere left to land. "This isn't finished," Wade answered him instead, stepping half in front of Junia, the way he had that first cruel afternoon at the depot. Only now the shielding ran the opposite direction. "It's finished the moment she's my wife, and she will be inside the week. Carry that back to your council." They married 8 days later on a clear, bitter morning in the front room of Corrigan Ranch. Junia in a deep blue wool dress, sewn with her own hands from fabric bought on her own wages. Sheriff Bannon and Agnes Odell standing as witnesses despite the church's cold disapproval. It wasn't the wedding either of them had once pictured for themselves. It was, Wade let her know quietly as he took her hand before the small gathering, the only wedding he wanted. The months that followed deepened everything that hard winter had begun. Spring came late, but arrived hard, and the whole prairie burst green almost overnight. The herd Junia had rebuilt calved out strong. The garden came up thick and generous, and slowly, unevenly, Sable Ridge began to soften toward them. A neighbor stopping in for coffee, an invitation to a barn raising, small mercies stacking up into something close to belonging. One warm evening on the porch, Wade finally raised the subject of the locked east room, and together they opened it. Marion's dressing table, a small boy's boots, a whole childhood he'd sealed away rather than properly grieve. They sorted through it slowly, painfully, keeping what mattered and giving the rest to families who needed it more than a locked room needed its ghosts. "Someday," Wade allowed, looking around the emptied space with something that wasn't quite peace, but was heading there, "maybe this could be a nursery again, not to replace what we lost, to make room for what comes after." "Someday," Junia agreed, and meant every word of it. 7 months into their marriage, standing together at the bedroom window, watching an October sunrise paint the whole spread gold, Wade let slip that he'd felt something that morning he'd nearly forgotten the shape of. Plain, uncomplicated happiness. Junia traced the old scar along his jaw, the very one that had first shown her how much this man had already survived, long before she ever stepped off that stage. "You gave me a home, not just a roof over my head, somewhere I actually belong." Sable Ridge never fully forgot the scandal of that first winter, and there would always be a few in town who'd remember the mail-order mix-up and the porch showdown with more relish than kindness. Reverend Kane and his closest followers stayed cool toward the Corrigans for years afterward, crossing the street rather than tip a hat. But others came around in their own time. The general store owner's wife took to greeting Junia by name and asking after the herd. Otis Bramwell and his family became regular Sunday guests. Sheriff Bannon's wife sent over preserves every autumn without fail. It wasn't universal forgiveness, and Junia stopped needing it to be. A few good people willing to look past a scandal to the truth underneath it turned out to be plenty. But the story reshaped itself with the years, the way true ones tend to. Less about a woman rejected in the street, more about what she'd built afterward with her own 2 hands, out of 40 scattered cattle and a house nobody believed could come back to life. And when other hopeful women stepped off that same depot platform in the seasons that followed, drawn west by promises that didn't always hold, more than one of them found their way out to Corrigan Ranch to sit at Junia's table and hear how a rejection could turn, given enough stubborn work, into exactly the life she'd wanted all along. That's the whole of it, the way it came down to me. A woman who lost everything twice over and built a home from what was left standing. A man who learned that letting someone in wasn't the same danger as losing them. And a ranch that came back from the very edge of the auction block because one cowgirl flatly refused to be sent home. If you've ridden along with me this far, you already know exactly where you've landed. This is Cowgirl Chronicles, and around here we tell it complete, from the first hoofbeat on that depot road to the very last light on the porch. So come sit by the fire a while longer, friend. There's always another story waiting just past the bend, and I'll leave the gate open for you whenever you're ready to ride back in.